Hi there, Lindsay from Prairie Fire here. Just wanted to give a quick thank you on behalf of the staff and board of Prairie Fire to the Composing Winnipeg class at the University of Winnipeg for working with us on this project and for conducting the interviews. As well, a big thank you to all of the authors who took time out of their busy day to be interviewed for this project. Just to let you know, this is a video series, so we will be posting more videos as well, or have already, depending on when you're watching this. So please check our channel for additional content, and we really hope you enjoy. On with the interview.
The more I live here, and I have lived elsewhere, but the more you appreciate what you see around you. You know, even just last month, we drove through into southern Manitoba in the afternoon, and the sun is not that high, and the angle of the light and so on creates all these interesting colors in the fields, and the mix of the stubble through the fields and the snow and the blues and the whites, and you know, you notice them, even though it seems like, oh, this is flat and so on. But I mean, what's a mountain but a big rock, you know? And so when I was taking creative writing courses at U of M, Robert Croach was one of my instructors, and he was very much someone who wrote about the prairie, and he kind of made it's okay to write about the prairie, and doesn't mean that you're provincial just because you write about the prairie, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that was a big encouragement for a lot of us. I first discovered Manitoba and prairie writers when I took Canadian literature back in the 60s. And at the time I didn't think much of it, but later it dawned on me, our professor, he had most of the fiction that he had put on the course was from the prairies, including a number of titles from Winnipeg. You know, after I graduated, I started seeking out Canadian writers and prairie writers, and as a result discovered writers like Robert Croach and Morley Callahan and Hugh McLennan and other writers from the prairies. Rudy Wiebe had published by this time, but in the meantime I was writing on my own. You know, I had no other writers that I knew, nobody to relate to, and then I decided to sign up for a creative writing course and found home. There's other people that want to do what I want to do. And I happened to be in this amazing class with people like Sandra Birdsell and Jake McDonald and Victor Enns and Brian McKinnon and so on. And all of us were just starting out. And suddenly we were part of a world that we hadn't experienced before. And this was also at a time when a lot of things were happening in Manitoba and Winnipeg. The little newsletter that became Prairie Fire had just started. The Manitoba Writers Guild was formed a little just after that. And so there was this, all of a sudden, all these people came out of the woodwork who wanted to write. They're rooted here, even when they write about other things and have gone on to write. Like Miriam Taves starts off, you know, writing about Winnipeg, and then eventually comes around to writing about some place that's referred to as close to Steinbach and so on. And she's moved away, but she's still writing about this world. David Bergen still lives here, but his writing has traveled all over. But it's always rooted in this place, I think. And And I think it has an effect on you. Everybody has to be somewhere, and writing about, trust your own experience, value your own experience. You don't have to write stories about New York or LA. Those aren't the only two places in the world. And imagination doesn't necessarily mean fantasies and spaceships and so on. It's imagining the world around you. I don't know if Mennonite literature is my specialty, but I write out of a specific landscape and time, I suppose. I spent the first 18 years of my life between the Red River and the Pembina Hills along the border with North Dakota. And for much of my growing up, I was surrounded by one ethnic group, the Mennonites. For the longest time, I thought that Mennonite and a resident of Manitoba were the same thing. And then gradually, you find out more things and so on. But I think it's somewhat unique to grow up surrounded by one ethnic group, as opposed to people who had grown up in Winnipeg. You're a little bit humbled in that, oh, well, here's us and there's those people, and look at what those guys can do. They have all this freedom to do all these things that we are forbidden from doing, and so on. So that creates an interesting tension for a writer, I think. I just have found a lot of interesting stories and characters there that haven't left me alone. And when I first wrote Yasch Siemens, I figured, okay, I'll get this done and then I'll move on to other things. And I don't have any Mennonite agenda in mind when I'm writing. These are interesting characters, they have stories, and I'm not a fan of generic characters and generic locations. So, his voice came about somewhat by accident. I had been reading W.P. Kinsella's early stories, where he had created this dialect about the Obima Reserve, which became controversial later. But anyway, I was interested in what he had done with the language, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to use the language of my background and write some funny stuff? And I was part of a writers group at the time, and I so it was my turn to bring a story to the group, and so I pushed this thing I had started to some kind of an ending and brought it to the group, thinking they would think I was crazy and that would be the end of it. And they responded warmly, and so that encouraged me. And this wasn't, there were a few Mennonite people in the group, but it was a very diverse group, actually. And they all responded to this language. And so that encouraged me. And so as I continued to write in this vein, I discovered that I could make this language do all kinds of things. It wasn't just for making jokes, that I could make it sing, and I could, and so that's what drove me. And then I was getting positive feedback, and Prairie Fire published my first two Yasch stories, and that gave me an audience. When I was writing Yasch, the way it moved, the way it worked was I was just totally immersed in his character and his point of view. And from his point of view, the stuff that happens to him isn't funny. So it's funny to the reader, but not for the character. When your pants fall down in front of an audience. That's not funny for you, but it's funny for them. But I think I don't consider myself a comedian, and I've never tried to do stand-up. For me, it always comes out of the characters, the way they see things. You see incongruencies, or you see how the characters describe things. They notice the incongruencies or the weird things about people. Well, I think it depends on the subject matter. When I was writing Tatsia, I was writing Tatsia. I was writing about those characters in that world. Yes, there are some humorous incidents, humorous passages, but mostly it's not a book of laughs. But the process in terms of writing wasn't all that different. I'm imagining a world, imagining characters, imagining how they would solve problems. With Yasch, I had to, he's only gone to grade 10, and so his vocabulary is somewhat limited. So I don't use many abstract words. And with Tatsia, I tried to see things through her eyes, how she would experience them without reference to the big world that we have now, where there isn't very much in this world that we haven't seen beforehand somewhere on TV or in pictures or whatever. Well, I was living in the Northwest Territories for 6 years. I was teaching in a small community. And the story of Tatsia, or that story of the woman who got kidnapped and then ended up bringing back the first rifle to her people, was told to me fairly early in my stay there. And as soon as I heard it, I thought, this needs to be an adventure story for younger readers. Over time, I heard more stories and so on, and had many experiences and absorbed things in the community. And so then 20 years later, I finally published this book. But I wouldn't have been able to write that novel if I hadn't lived in the community. So in many ways, Tatsia is a book I'm most proud of, because of how it was received by the people who I had written about and also for. An elder thanked me for writing the novel because she used it with young women to begin conversations about their traditions. It's important in a world where we're bombarded with stories from all over and all these fantasies, and yet we often don't get a chance to read about our own experience. But after he had told his child all the stories he could remember about Yamaza, Ikutsali told her stories about her mother, Tatsia the hawk. One story seemed to bring a smile to the baby's face. It was a story of how Tatsia would turn into a hawk and fly high above the trees until she would spy the baby below in Ikutsali's arms. The hawk would float down like a feather and perch on the log beside them and stare at them with her hawk eyes. Her feathers would drop to the ground, and Tatsia would reach out and cuddle the baby in her arms until the sun had risen and set as many times as there were mosquitoes in a swamp. This story made Gutenthal feel so good and became so real in his mind, he began to believe it himself. But Gutenthal feared the night. Nightmares disturbed his sleep, and twice he awakened to his daughter's cry and discovered that he had almost crushed her beneath him as he rolled over in his sleep. He had made a small swing in the shelter, but the nights were too cold to leave his child alone up in the swing when there was just one adult in the shelter to warm up the air. In winter, people kept each other warm, and children slept between their parents. But when he rested the baby on his chest and did his best to fall asleep on his back without moving, the dreams got more terrifying. Especially the wrestling dream. That was when he moved most violently in his sleep. Yet what could he do? Always the dream began the same way. He was with Tatsia, watching her at the bathing rock, watching her nurse the baby, watching her cut up fish. Or he was sleeping next to her in the tent, or paddling in the canoe down the river to the falls to fish for grayling. Tatsia was talking to him, or talking to the baby. He heard her voice clearly at his ear. He smelled the wood smoke in her hair. He tasted her cheek with his lips. Her hand caressed his chest under his shirt, her dark eyes sparkling.